This lecture is on waste management in the 3 Rs. It's taken from modules 51 and 52 from Friedland and Relyea Environmental Science for AP. So let's get started. First off, we need to acknowledge that humans are the only organisms that create true waste. Everything else in nature is virtually waste-free. The dung from elephants can be rolled up and used by the dung beetle and eventually decomposed and recycled back into its original nutrients. But humans create things that can't be recycled. They can't be broken down. They are permanently with us, and the life cycle may be 10,000 years, 20,000 years before it goes away. We have new research too showing that plastics actually don't ever go away. They don't ever break down completely. They just get turned into smaller and smaller pieces, which is why we're finding some studies that show that humans have plastics in their body now, nanoplastics, because the particles don't ever actually biodegrade. So that brings us to the question of where did all of this waste come from and what are we going to do about it? So first of all, here's where it came from. The solid waste system is the processing of raw materials such as petroleum or wood or other types of fibers, minerals, things like that, and energy, and creating usable products from that. So then those products have a certain life cycle. They get used and reused, and eventually they get thrown away. And once they get thrown away, those are considered outputs, material that can be recycled or disposed of, and waste energy. So this system looks great from a diagram point of view. The problem is that raw materials are limited, energy is limited on planet Earth, and we can't just keep pushing more inputs into the system because at some point we're not going to have them anymore because we're creating all of these outputs, and a lot of those outputs, like I mentioned, plastics, are not going anywhere. They're not going away, and they aren't being recycled or reused the way they should be. So here's a look at the United States waste system. This is our original waste stream. So you can see, and really important to note here is that paper makes up 30% of our waste stream. It is the largest single item or single type of waste that we generate, and the largest by far. Now this is the original waste stream. If you look at it after recycling, which we'll take a look at in a minute, you'll see that the numbers change slightly. So before we do that, test yourself real quick. The largest component of MSW, which stands for municipal solid waste, is A, paper, B, plastic, C, aluminum, or D, food waste. Go ahead and check yourself and move forward when you're ready. So if you said A, paper, you would be correct. So after recovery and disposal, as I mentioned, we have about 53% of paper that can be recovered. We recover 53% of what is recovered is paper. And we also recover yard waste, some food scraps, some wood, a little bit of plastic, a little bit of metal and glass and things like that. Now the stuff that we discard, so we recover about 79 million metric tons. The stuff that we discard is almost double that, or basically double that. And that would be our also still quite a lot of paper that gets discarded. You can see there yard waste, wood, and food scraps. All of those things are discarded, but they actually are compostable. So we are getting rid of a lot of things that could have been diverted from the waste stream, and those are just ending up in the landfill. We also have things like plastics and metals, glass, and then textiles and things that still are ending up in our waste stream, even though they could have been recovered and recycled. So how does solid waste management work? We're going to talk about a few different ways that we can manage our solid waste. So you've heard of the 3 Rs before. We'll go into those. There's also composting. And then in our next lecture, we'll discuss sanitary landfills and incineration. And this here is a picture of an open dump. We don't recommend that as a method of disposal. We'll talk about why in our lecture on Module 53. So let's talk about the 3 R's now. You've heard them all, and everyone has learned, growing up singing songs by Jack Johnson, reduce, reuse, recycle. They actually are in an order for a reason, and we're going to talk about that. So the most important thing to do is to reduce. This means that we are minimizing waste or preventing it before it's even generated. So one example of this would be source reduction. So we can redesign products or use different materials so that we don't even generate the waste in the beginning. If you ever are, let's say, in charge of a company and you're deciding what kind of packaging something is going to have, I would recommend, and an example of source reduction would be to use the smallest possible amount of packaging. So thin plastic instead of big hard plastic. Or don't even use plastic at all. Package your item in like recycled paper or recycled cardboard, something like that. So one of the benefits of this is it can reduce the energy needed during manufacturing. So that's a great advantage for companies to do source reduction. And some examples would be copy machines that can print double-sided. We didn't used to have those, but now we do. And so that allows you to use half the amount of paper. You don't need to print things single-sided. If you ever have a teacher or who's printing single-sided, I encourage you to help them see the benefits of double-sided copying. You could have smaller packaging for CDs. You could see how dated that is. Nobody buys CDs anymore. That is a great way to reduce waste. Go digital. And then also things like less toxic paints. That can reduce the amount of toxic waste that we have. Other examples would be like buying your food in bulk, because then you don't have as much packaging. If you buy like a 25-pound bag of rice is going to have a lot less packaging than buying 5-pound bags of rice. So those are all ways that you can reduce waste at the outset. Now the next one is reuse. So reuse, we've already got the product. We can't do anything about that. Reusing something extends the amount of time that product is being used before it ends up in a landfill. So it's basically like extending the life of the product. Ideally, reuse does not require any additional energy if you're doing it well. In some cases it does if things need to be cleaned or sterilized. But there's lots of ways we can reuse without using additional energy. Reuse used to be really common in the United States. Actually, there was a time way back, in the 1950s when your milk would get delivered to your door in a glass bottle. And there was a job called a milkman, and he would take the milk from the local dairy and it would be in bottles and he'd deliver it to houses. And then you would leave out your empty bottles and those would go and get cleaned, and then they would bring them back with, milk in them. That was an example of reuse that was very common. There were lots of other examples. People, if you ever have the opportunity to talk to a grandparent or a great-grandparent who was alive during the Depression or just after that, people reused everything at that time. Like nothing could be thrown away because everything had value and everything was seen as having a second life or another use. We don't have that mindset anymore. We have very much a throwaway mindset now, which is something that needs to be changed in the United States. So like I said, we had reusable milk bottles. You actually can still reuse soda bottles, like in Mexico. If you go to a restaurant, you get your soda in a glass bottle. You drink your soda, you leave the bottle there, and then they will take that, send it back to the factory, and they'll fill it with more soda, sterilize it, and fill it with more soda. We used to have metal and cloth containers, which actually are kind of making a comeback now, rather than disposable or plastic. Other examples of reuse would be things like using secondhand clothes or buying secondhand clothes, using newspaper if you still get the newspaper for animal bedding. You can donate used equipment sometimes, or you can sell it secondhand. And things like reusable envelopes that they use at the district office for internal memos. All kinds of stuff like that. Some of the great resources we have available to us now is you can buy things secondhand. So there's all kinds of websites like 5 Mile or OfferUp, where you can sell your old stuff, and rather than someone buying something new that requires new materials, you actually get to participate in reuse, which is good for the planet, and you make some money. And then we have recycling. So recycling is the kind that everyone normally thinks of. Recycling is when your materials go on to become new products. And really this should be your last option after you've reduced after you've reused, then finally you want to recycle. Recycling does require some energy input. It depends on what we're talking about recycling. The amount of energy varies. Usually recycling requires less energy than making products from raw materials. This is especially true of aluminum. It requires approximately 1/3 of the amount of energy to make an aluminum can from recycled aluminum compared to making an aluminum can from raw aluminum that's been mined. So we definitely want to use recycling as our option for aluminum cans, but also for other things it's a very good solution. So 40% less energy for paper, 60% less energy for plastic. Sorry, my mistake. 95% less energy to make a can from recycled aluminum versus raw aluminum. So for all of these things, it's very beneficial to recycle. And I highly recommend that you make that a part of your lifestyle. You can also actually get some money back in the state of California. Not for paper typically, but for plastic and aluminum and glass, you can. So which of the following here would be an example of reduce? So you want to think back to our first R, reduce. Would it be A, a glass soda bottle is sterilized and refilled? B, an aluminum can is melted down and made into a new can? C, a USB memory stick is sold in a paper wrapper instead of hard plastic packaging? Or D, food waste is broken down by microorganisms into fertilizer? So take a moment and think about that. Pause if you need to. And our correct answer is C. A USB memory stick is sold in a paper wrapper instead of hard plastic packaging. So paper is potentially compostable. It definitely is biodegradable. And it's a lot lighter than those really big, thick, hard plastic packages. So if you have to package your product, let's package it in the one that has the least environmental impact. So this would be an example of reducing the amount of waste that's generated. All right, so there's a couple kinds of recycling that I wanted to talk about here. The first one is closed loop recycling, which is an example shown in this picture here. So we use raw materials and create this carpet fibers, let's say, in this example. And then this carpet goes and it's put into an office building or into a home, and it lives its life. Maybe the carpet is there for 10 years, 15 years, it gets worn out, it gets dirty and stained. At the end of that carpet's life, rather than sending it back just straight to the landfill, they have something called carpet recycling. And so when the carpet is ripped out and new carpet is put in there, the old carpet is collected and taken for recycling and actually turned back into new carpet fibers. So it's cleaned and sterilized and whatever, and it's made into new carpet. You could actually buy carpet that's been recycled. So it's made from those recycled fibers, which is really cool. So that's closed loop recycling. We're taking something and we're turning it back into the same product. So carpet gets recycled back into carpet. Aluminum cans get recycled back into aluminum cans. There's also another kind of recycling called open loop recycling. And open loop recycling is when you take raw materials, create your thing. In this case, it's a bottle. The consumers use the bottle gets collected. Instead of getting disposed of in a landfill, it gets recovered and processed and turned into something different. So in this case, it gets turned into fiber. But it's not just directly turned into fiber. That you actually have to use a little bit more raw materials to create those fibers. But then those fibers are able to be turned into something like a jacket. So we've got cases where we have plastic bottles, like milk cartons are being turned into kids' toys. There's a whole brand called Green Toys that does that. There are examples of like other types of plastic being turned into siding that's used like for the outside of a building. We have deck material. Like if you wanted to build a deck at your house, you could, instead of using wood, you could use recycled plastic. And then we have all kinds of things where, just various products, like you can buy shirts that say, I used to be a water bottle and things like that. So open loop recycling is a second type of recycling. One of the drawbacks is that it does require more raw materials typically than closed loop recycling. So the difference between closed loop and open loop recycling is A, closed loop requires no new energy, while open loop requires significant energy input. B, closed loop requires primarily raw materials while open loop does not. Or C, closed loop is the recycling of a product into the same product, while open loop recycles a product into a different product. So pause if you need to. And the correct answer is C. Closed loop recycles a product back into the same product, while open loop recycles a product into a different product. And between the two, closed loop is better, but both are good. Now, some of the drawbacks to recycling. Why is recycling not the solution? So, first of all, there's a lot of time and energy required to separate the materials. Somebody has to be paid to do that. We don't have machines yet. I think we're working on robots that are sophisticated enough, but ultimately, at the end of the day, there's only so much that they can do. And you have to have people who are participating in that process. Now, there's single stream recycling. You got paid employees, like I said, who sort the materials. And then we always have the problem of supply and demand. So because some materials are not always in high demand, it may be difficult for the recycler to sell them, which is something that's going to be a disincentive for them to actually even collect or accept that item. So, for example, the price of paper, recycled paper, varies wildly. Sometimes you can get, $40 for an entire bin full of recycled paper. Other times you can get $60. And it depends on how much the paper manufacturers are paying for recycled paper at the time. So OCC does not give any money for recycled paper because it's not worth their time. And other places that do offer money for recycled paper or recycling paper, they don't pay very much. So it's very rarely worth the time and effort that people have to put in order to actually collect it and recycle it. So let's move on to the last one. It's not one of the R's, but it should be, because composting is awesome. And we actually have the privilege in Costa Mesa of being one of the first cities in the state that had commercial composting available. So what is composting? Composting basically takes organic food and yard waste from landfills and uses them for something other than just letting them sit there and decompose. So the problem with decomposition is that in a landfill, they will decompose anaerobically. So if you can picture a landfill to yourself, we'll see pictures of them in the next lecture, but in a landfill, you've got piles and piles and piles of trash, and it's all compressed and compacted as much as it possibly can be. And that means that there's no room for oxygen in there. So once the little bit of oxygen present is used up, the bacteria that are able to survive switch over to being those anaerobic bacteria. So they'll decompose the food and the yard waste material, but in the process they produce methane. And methane is a greenhouse gas, and is also flammable. There's that portion of it. So instead of allowing our food and yard waste to go to a landfill, what we can do is we can compost it. And composting creates a natural fertilizer that can be used to fertilize crops. It can improve soil structure. It contains like that partially decayed organic material in addition to lots of nitrates and phosphates. So it's ideal for plant growth. And composting is actually what happens if you just let your leaves stay on the grass. If you leave them there long enough, eventually the bacteria are going to begin to decompose those, and will turn them into back into their raw materials and that humus. That's that nice, dark, rich earth that's really good for growing things. So composting, if it's done properly, doesn't produce any bad smells. It just smells like dirt. And there's a bunch of different examples. We have outdoor large-scale composting. You can actually do backyard composting if you wanted to. There are worm bins you can get where you are composting with worms. And then they also have these electric ones that you can put in your kitchen that plug in. And they require more energy, but they also do the process a lot faster. So you can just drop all of your food waste into one of those, and it composts it and spits soil right out there in your, it doesn't spit it out, but it produces soil right in your kitchen. Now, if you do decide to have a compost pile of your own, you should know that maintenance is really important. Compost piles have to be turned frequently. So you have to get in there with a pitchfork or something and turn it over so that you prevent overheating. And you want to make sure that you keep a good amount of oxygen flowing through your compost pile, because otherwise you're going to end up with anaerobic decomposition and methane, which, remember, methane is explosive. So that would be a problem. And you want to make sure that you maintain a 30-to-1 ratio of carbon to nitrogen. That sounds, really complicated, but the basic thing there, the basic idea is that you are mixing in your food waste with your lawn clippings or leaves. So lawn clippings and leaves tend to be mostly cellulose, so they're very high in carbon, whereas vegetables are more complex and easier to digest. They don't have as much cellulose, so they have a lot more nitrogen present, and we want to make sure you mix all those up. Lawn clippings and leaves mixed with your vegetables. Now, some of the drawbacks to composting, why doesn't everybody do this? Well, it requires time because you have to maintain it. It also requires space. So if you don't have a space to do composting, that would be a drawback. And then you can sometimes attract vermin, otherwise known as rats or skunks or raccoons, things that like to dig through your garbage. And then the biggest drawback here, or potentially the worst one, is that if you don't properly maintain your compost pile, it can spontaneously ignite. So what happens is that if you are not turning it regularly and introducing oxygen, the methane builds up, again, produced because of the lack of oxygen, the anaerobic decomposition. So you get the buildup of methane and you get the buildup of excessive heat, and the combination of those two leads to a minor explosion or sort of a fire. And there have been cases of people's compost piles catching on fire and then burning down their house. So again, if you're going to decide to do composting, make sure you do it right. Make sure you do it safely. And it can be really advantageous, especially if you like gardening. So here's a picture of someone showing how you can create soil, good, hardy. And that is all we have for Module 51 and 52.